Well, hello. Welcome to Treeline. If this is your first time here, thanks for coming. Glad you guys found us. We're going to jump into the Bible, a couple different spots, but I wanted to just kind of start with a story. So we're in the middle of this series, this new series we're doing for kind of 6 weeks. We're taking a break of kind of working through the Gospel of Matthew each week, and we're talking about becoming who we are. And last week we talked about being formed by story, and this week we're talking about how we are formed by devotion. And I want to just kind of start with all of us picturing something together, all right? So go with me here. It's a little bit long. It's a little bit of like a kind of a get your head in this space, but follow me on this, okay? I want you to just picture yourself, that you are like sitting in a small boat at the edge of kind of the shore of the Sea of Galilee, okay? Just put yourself in the boat, right? You got some waves that are kind of rolling in and out. You kind of feel it underneath you, right? You can kind of hear seagulls around you, and it's like a beautiful day. Like, it's not like beautiful Michigan day where it's like sunny but 19 degrees. It's like 78. It's beautiful, right? And you are here, and you're just kind of sitting in your boat. And then this boat's been in your family for as long as you can remember. I mean, this boat is your life. Like, the wood on the edges of kind of the sides are like worn down, patinaed from years of like your own hands and like ropes throwing over it that you've done all your whole life ever since you were a kid. And you live your life like a lot of the rest of the people you grew up with because you are a fisherman. And being a fisherman means something. And on this day, you're kind of sitting in your boat in your life, and all of a sudden you begin to hear this commotion kind of coming down the shore line. And you're not totally sure what it is, but you kind of see there's this guy walking on the shore your direction. And there's like this huge crowd of people behind him. And you're like really intrigued by this, you know? And so you kind of paddle a little bit closer to the shore to try to figure out what's going on. And as he gets closer, you can hear his name being whispered by the people standing near you, Jesus. And you aren't sure where he's going, but you're trying to figure out if there's a way that you can kind of anchor your boat and kind of get out and kind of get near him because you've heard some of the stories about him. You don't know much about him, but you know he's a really, really special person. And as you're kind of trying to figure out how you can get close to him, you realize that Jesus is actually not just walking on the shore, but he's actually kind of walking right towards you. And as he gets a little bit closer, you realize he's not kind of walking aimlessly near you. He's actually looking directly at you. And you kind of look over your shoulder. You're looking at someone else. And it's like, no, he has his eyes locked on you. And eventually Jesus gets just a few feet from the water, and he's right in front of you, and you're in this boat holding some ropes. And eventually he stops. And the whole crowd stops behind him. And he's only a few feet from you now. And he's looking at you. And then he calls out your name. He calls out your name in front of everyone, and he says, I want you to follow me. And this whole like murmur goes through the crowd, right? And they're saying Jesus' name, but now they're saying your name too. And they're like, oh my gosh. Like, Jesus knows this person. Like, we've known him our whole lives. He's always lived here, but Jesus knows him. And you can't believe it in this moment because you're kind of, in this moment, you're like, Jesus, you want to identify with me and you want me to identify with you? And you're kind of stunned. And because you know who Jesus is. You know he's a nice guy, but he would kind of call you out so specifically feels like an honor that's beyond, your status in life. And your father's next to you, and he's kind of blown out of the water too. What an honor to be called out by name, by Jesus. And in that moment, you're like, feel in your heart. You're like, everything about my life and my heart is going to change because in this moment, you're just deciding like, I want to be like Jesus. And you're so overwhelmed by the kind of love and kindness that Jesus has shown you in that moment. It kind of just, you feel like it's going to shape everything about your life. And as you see Jesus kind of slowly kind of walk into the crowd, you kind of realize and you make this like assertion in your heart. You're like, nothing is ever going to be the same again. And the whole rest of the day, you just kind of play out that scene in your head over and over again. Like what love, what kindness from Jesus. And the next morning when you wake up, you wake up early. Like, your morning's not the same as it always has used to be. And so what you do is you find these little scraps of parchment, and there's not that many of them. They're kind of like hard to come by in this time and day, but you get them and you kind of actually write down some of the stories that you've heard Jesus say or kind of that have been filtered to you from your friends who've been to some of his teachings. And you start to kind of, as you're coiling the ropes in the morning, you're thinking about these things. You start to rehearse them to yourself early in the morning, and you start to kind of retell his stories and parables as you kind of cast your lines into the Sea of Galilee. You're trying to pull in fish. You're always thinking about Jesus. And this goes on for some time. You tell the other people you fish about or you fish with, you tell them about Jesus and this moment you met him. And for a while, it kind of defines everything about your life. And, you get more and more of these snippets of Jesus teaching from your friends or others that you know who collect them because they kind of know you're about Jesus. And even occasionally when work kind of slows down, you're able to get away for a few hours and go to one of Jesus's teachings when it's happening kind of near where you are. And each time he remembers you and he says the same thing. And over the next year, things kind of with you and Jesus, they kind of start to slow down, right? Business starts to become a lot to handle. And your business is growing. And this kind of fishing enterprise that's been part of your whole family, it starts to kind of take off. And with more employees comes more managerial work. And these mornings that you spent just kind of coiling the rope and thinking about Jesus' teaching starts to get kind of crowded out by all this stuff you have to do for this business and your employees. And you still think about Jesus regularly, but if you're honest, life just is starting to get really busy. And between your work and some of your other interests, there isn't just very much time in the day to try to keep up with all the new things that Jesus keeps teaching on. And eventually you actually stop collecting these new sayings of Jesus from your friends because you kind of have enough already that are in your pocket you haven't had a chance yet to memorize or even kind of really give much thought to. And as the years go by, you find yourself spending less and less time remembering that day on the shore. It's still a part of your story, but there's just so many other things that happen in life that the part of you that was focused around Jesus had just been kind of squeezed to some small corner of your life. And when he comes to mind, you don't often feel the joy you used to, but sometimes you actually feel guilt and shame for how little you've managed to kind of keep up with him and what he's doing in the world. And sometimes you feel shame because of how far you are from who you really thought he meant you to be in that moment. And you still love him. I mean, how could you not for how he's treated you? He's always been so kind to you, but you sometimes wish that things had gone differently for you, that life was a little less busy, that you had more energy for these things, that you had more time to give yourself to some of the things that you dreamed about your own life all those years ago. And sometimes you find it frustrating that your growing business and the kind of the demands of your life, they only seem to grow more and more every year that goes by, and it seems as though you never really have time for the things you wanted your life to be about. Your life is just really, really busy now. So that's the story. Now, if you had to boil it down to one thing, what went wrong? And there's a few ways you could answer this, right? Like, well, it's the problem in this story is you kind of take on the story yourself. You kind of put yourself in the story. The problem is your heart, right? You're too distracted, or maybe it's that you didn't keep up with your habits, right? You started this thing where you're rehearsing the teachings of Jesus, but then eventually you kind of let those things go, or maybe you let your heart drift, or maybe you're overcommitted, maybe you don't have enough perseverance, but the problem in this story is none of those things. There's like one problem that just like sends this whole story off the rails from the very beginning, and the problem was that you never got out of the boat. You never got out of the boat. Like the Son of God walked up to you and he told you, hey, I want you to follow me. And then eventually Jesus walked away and you didn't follow him. You stayed in your boat. And the reason I'm telling this story is because I think this story actually represents the story of a lot of us. What it's like for a lot of us to try to follow Jesus. And I think this story represents kind of what happens when you try to become someone with the heart of Christ without taking on the life of discipleship, right? And if you know how the story of Jesus begins, right? It begins in the exact same way. Jesus walks up to somebody in a boat and he invites them to follow him. And the thing that they do is they get out of their boat, they drop their nets, and they go and follow Jesus. And I just want to use for a moment, picture the difference between the Apostle Peter and this story of this person. I mean, how unbelievably different is the lives of these two people. One of them is with Jesus all the time, following him everywhere. His whole life is shaped by Jesus, and he becomes the leader of the new movement of Jesus people called the church. And the other one is kind of stuck in his old life, in his boat, frustrated. He can't seem to figure out how to get his heart to be like the one he wants to be like. It's like when we try to become like Jesus in our hearts while still really living as disciples of the world. And I think this is one of our biggest issues in the church today. Again, it's not just an issue with us, but it's this disconnect that we have with kind of where everything started. Like we have this huge disconnect from what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus in the first world. Because if you kind of are reading these stories about being a disciple of Jesus, you kind of had an idea of what it meant to be a disciple, right? And because this is what happens, right? Jesus, he picks some people, he says, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men, and they become his disciples. And then at the very end of the story, right, at the end of Matthew, Jesus takes these followers, these disciples, and he sends them out into the world and he says, go and make disciples. So the whole idea of what is this whole thing going on, it has to do with being a disciple of Jesus. And to be someone's disciple actually meant something really specific. It literally, quite literally meant that whatever you are currently doing in your life, where you lived, what occupation you had, what hobbies you had, what interests you had, it literally meant that you made a clean cut from all of those things in your life, and you embarked on this new relationship where you literally followed somebody around every day, all the time. You went where they went, you did what they did, you listened to what they said, and you tried to actually have their life be like a blueprint that you traced your life over. That's what it meant to be a disciple. And so we can look at this story of someone who like never actually gets out of the boat, and we can be like, oh, you missed it, that's so silly. But I think if we're honest, a lot of us do the same kind of thing. And so here's our problem. I think one of our problems that we have is we're trying to follow Jesus. And one of the problems we have when we're trying to become who we are is we've turned Christianity into a series of truth statements about what we need to believe in instead of a person we're meant to be disciples of. And because of that, our lives lack devotion. Our lives lack devotion. We've tried to think rightly about Jesus in our minds, but we've actually chosen to still fill our lives with the same thing that the rest of the world fills their lives with. And what ends up happening is our lives become so full that there's just little time for us to actually give ourselves to becoming who we are. And so I think if you'd sit Jesus down and you say, Jesus, help me with this situation. Or I think if this person in the boat sat Jesus down and goes, Jesus, I'm trying to figure out what's going wrong. Jesus would be like, hey, get out of the boat, right? Like, you don't need to stay there. Get out of the boat, come with me. And so I think the solution for us is to cultivate a life of devotion to Jesus. Another way you could say that is just to become a disciple. Now, let me read this again. Adam read this, but let me read it again. Matthew 11, 20 through 30. This is what Jesus says. He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When Jesus speaks about taking people like us out of the boat, he's pulling us into a very specific type of relationship. And the image that he gives us is actually a yoke, which is a really fitting illustration. It's like you take two animals and you'd like yoke them together, like something you put on the neck of one, it would connect to the neck of the other. And basically what it meant is like you can't move in any other direction except for the direction that the person next to you is moving in. Quite literally meaning you walk where they walk. You share the same pace. You go in their direction. And so when Jesus is calling his disciples, the world had a category for that. But for most of us in our lives today, we don't have a great category for that. But if you want to just think of it simply, I would just say this. Discipleship was about devotion. Devotion, right? So you're saying no to every kind of other thing in the world in order to devote yourself to being with this one person and to become like them. It was a really simple life, you know, and in order to be a disciple of Jesus, you actually had to say no to almost everything else. You couldn't also say yes to a bunch of stuff and be a disciple of Jesus because it was so all-encompassing. Because literally, wherever Jesus went, you went with him. And whatever he did, you did that. And so all of your kind of old interests in life, it had to go by the wayside because you now had this new ambition, and it was to follow Jesus. All right, so last week we talked about the $300 billion that America spends on advertising each year, right? And we're saying, hey, there's $300 billion being leveraged kind of to get you to believe a different story about yourself than what is true of you. And we said this, right? We said, you need to have a really powerful vision for your life or the world will give you theirs. And that was kind of last week, right? The world has gotten really good at shaping us, at giving us a story that we then live from. But the world has also gotten extremely good at taking our time from us. I don't know if you feel this way, but the world has become expert at commandeering our attention. And it's hard to actually like understand what has happened in the world over the last 100 years, but let me just kind of lay out some of the changes, how technology has actually shaped the world you live in, which is now shaping you, okay? Look, we're going to jump into some stuff. Some of this is from the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Some of it's from Dallas Willard. Some of it's from New York Times, from a bunch of different places. But none of this is my stuff, okay? But listen to this. Before Thomas Edison created the light bulb, do you know how long the average person slept? Throw out a guess. Yeah, it's 11. 11. The average human being slept 11 hours every single night before we invented the light bulb, okay? So that seems like inconsequential, right? But like the Amish are onto something. They were like, I don't know, right? Like I got to figure out this light thing before I just take it into my life. I was reading this. This is what one pastor says. He says, I used to read biographies of great men and women from history who got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to pray. St. Teresa, John Wesley, Charles Spurgeon. And I would think, wow, they are way more serious about Jesus than I am. True. But then I realized that they went to bed at 7 o'clock. And after 9 hours of sleep, what else was there to do? Before we had any modern technology, you see just a large amount of Christians spent far more time intentionally pursuing God because their life was actually just a little bit more quiet and secluded than ours is today. And actually, I just want to say, like, it is going to be harder for you to follow Jesus today than it probably was for somebody 100 years ago. It doesn't mean that anything's really changed about the world. Like, it's still the same forces, but those forces are now so efficient at shaping you. Like those things are now, the world is so good now at monopolizing our time and our attention. And we invented all this stuff as a means to help us flourish, right? And there was this idea that technology would save us time. And, by using this, we'd have more time and allow us to do the things that were important to us. And actually, it's interesting, if you go back and you read kind of the futurist writers in the 60s who were kind of seeing this movement play out, the thing that they were most worried about that was going to be like the most detrimental thing to humanity is that we would have too much time for leisure. Does that describe your life today? It's really interesting. We do have more technology today than anyone did in the 60s. I mean, if you pull out your phone, you have way, way, way more computing power than you ever need to go to the moon. And so we have so much more technology, but the average American now works 4 weeks more per year than in 1980. So everything's easier. We get way more done, but we work 4 weeks more every single year than we used to. You see, our modern world has actually made it easier to get things done. That's true, but that didn't lead us to rest. What happened was our modern world made it much easier to fill our lives with things. And it's so easy now that our lives are filled to the absolute brink. So I want to talk about this. Do you know that the average male spends 10,000 hours playing video games by the time they're in their 20s? I know, right? Dang, all right? And here's what's so interesting about that number. 10,000 hours is kind of like universally assessed as like the amount of time it takes someone to become like a top tier expert in a field. So it's like if you look at like the truly great people, like the Annie Leibovitzes of photography, how did you do that? She's like, I spent 10,000 hours cultivating that craft. And the average dude who's in his 20s is like, I have spent 10,000 hours cultivating my craft, right? And Annie Leibovitz, right? And so here's the tension. We're spending all of this amount of time doing something that, if we're just really honest with ourselves, it's not making us more like Jesus. Do you know that 10,000 hours is the amount of time that it would take you to become extremely proficient and even fluent in 10 languages? You could learn Greek and Hebrew fluently, like enough that you wouldn't just be able to read the commentaries, but you could like read the whole Bible in original languages. You could, on top of that, learn Spanish, and French and Italian and German and Chinese and Japanese and Arabic and Hindi and be really, really competent in all of those cultures. You just have to not play video games. Charles Chu, he's this writer, he just kind of spends time writing. I think he's from New York Times, but he wrote this article on reading 200 books a year. I read this like 5 years ago and it blew me away because I've always been someone that kind of wants to read, but I've always been in this place where I'm like, I don't have enough time to read as much as I want to. And so he wrote this article. He goes, well, what do you have to do to read 200 books a year? Does anyone feel like that's a lot of books? It's a lot of books, okay? I don't think anyone in here reads 200 books a year. If you do, that's awesome. But he just said, how do you do that? Well, the average American reads 200 to 400 words per minute. And the average nonfiction book is 50,000 words. And so he just kind of averaged this out, and he goes, to read 200 books a year, you need to spend 417 hours reading. Now, he's super smart. So let's just assume he's like really wrong. And you're like, no, we read way slower than you do, man. Like, you don't know how slow we read. So let's just say he's off by 50%. Okay, that means to read 200 books a year, you would need to read for 630 hours. And that seems like a massive amount of time, but the average American, do you know how much time they spend on social media every year? 900. It's about 2.5 hours a day. And so if you replace social media with reading, you would read way more than 200 books a year. And do you know how much TV we watch in a year? It's 1,600 hours. So this is, the reason I'm kind of pulling is because I think we have this tension where we're like, we are busy and we don't have time. But at the end of our lives, the average amount of time that people in this room will spend either watching TV or scrolling on our phones, at the end of our lives, you add all that time up, it'll be about 15 years. So 15 years, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year for 15 years. It's just spent kind of being distracted from our real, true purpose in life. And Jesus actually talks about this kind of regularly. Here's a story that maybe you've not kind of tied to this, but I want to tie this story to it. This is Jesus telling one of his parables about the great banquet. And so he just says this. And he said to them, he says, a man once gave a great banquet. And he invited many people. And at that time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who'd been invited, hey, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. And the first said to him, I've bought a field and I need to go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I bought actually 5 yoke of oxen and I need to go examine them. Please have me excused. And another said, I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. And then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city. Just bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Just get anyone you can in here to this banquet. And the servant said, sir, what you commanded has been done and there's still room. And the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet. Now, there's like a whole bunch of sermons you could teach on this. And I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I just want to notice, like, what's the reason that when Jesus is talking about like the kingdom of God and what keeps people from entering in truly to this, even though the invitation is on the table? Well, it isn't that they're antagonistic to him. And at least in this story, it isn't that they're hostile. They're simply too busy. I mean, Jesus' picture of what the kingdom of heaven is like is that there's a bunch of people who reject him not out of anger or resentment or evil. They reject him because they simply have something that's more important to them. And if you want to boil it down to the simplest terms possible, they really want to come, but their lives are just too full already. So one of the questions I think we need to ask this morning is, are we too busy to actually be disciples of Jesus? Are you too busy to be a disciple of Jesus? This is what Ronald Rolheiser says. He says, today, a number of historical circumstances are blindly flowing together and accidentally conspiring to produce a climate within which it is difficult not just to think about God or to pray, but to simply have any interior depth whatsoever. We, for every kind of reason, good and bad, are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. It is not necessarily that we have some specific thing against God or depth or the Spirit. And if we're kind of pressed, we would like these things, but it's just that we're too habitually preoccupied to have any of these actually show up on our radar screens. John Ortberg says it like this, even simpler. He says, for many of us, the great danger is not that we will renounce our faith. It is that we will become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied that we will settle for a mediocre version of it. This is what he says. He says, we will simply just skim our lives instead of actually living them. Does that feel a little bit like your life? It's like everything is happening so fast, and every day feels like you don't have enough time, and it's like you are just skipping across the surface of your life instead of ever actually slowing down enough to live it. And it's because of this that I think this is true of us. I think it's the reason the very first thing that Jesus does with his disciples is he tells them and he invites them to leave what they're doing and come away with him, to follow him. And for many of us, the pace and schedule of our lives, if we're just totally honest, it doesn't leave enough margin for a meaningful spiritual life to exist. We're simply too busy with our children's soccer practices or our social media or our hobbies or our television or our internet or our resume building, put in the simplest way possible. Many of us, and if you are anything like the normal modern person in America, it means most of us are simply too busy to follow Jesus. And so what it means practically is that our lives are so filled with noise that it's really hard to hear the still small voice of God in your life. And that they're too full to give that relationship the time it needs to mature and grow. And so Jesus' invitation to us is to cultivate a life of discipleship with him. And a life of discipleship is a life of devotion. It's a life of devotion. Now let me tell you about one of the most devoted people I've ever met in my life. He's a man named Brian Dermody, all right? Some of you guys know who this is. He's from Iowa City. He used to be on staff there on Salt Company with me, and now he's just on staff at the church there. But Brian is, amongst many things, there's kind of like, he's a follower of Jesus, but then like right next to that, right underneath that, he is a power lifter, okay? And all of his life is shaped around one thing, deadlifting the most amount of weight possible, okay? Like everything. And this isn't just like something that he does where you're like, no, it's gym time. It's like, no, this spills out into every single area of his life. And so whenever you're with him and you're going to go out to eat with him, you got a big group, you sit down at the restaurant, everyone else gets a menu. Brian's like, don't need it. Don't need the menu. He pulls out of his horrible little backpack this smashed up lunchbox that goes with him everywhere, and he pulls out the same horrible lunch every single day. 2 chicken breasts, dry. No sauce, no seasoning, just dry cooked chicken. Raw broccoli and carrots. Not little carrots that are sweet, horse carrots. Like massive, the kind of things you'd find in South Line at the gas station to feed to horses. Like that's what's in his lunchbox. It's a lunchbox of suffering, okay? That's what I called it. And every single time you go out to eat, he'd eat the same exact thing every single time. And then if you're with him and you're like, hey, let's go out after work, we're going to kind of hang out as friends. And Brian, he was simply the worst. Either he wouldn't come or he would come and he would fall asleep immediately, okay? And the reason was because Brian slept for exactly 9 hours a night, every night. I haven't slept for 9 hours in years, okay? It's been so long. And it's because of my children. But anyway, he sleeps for 9 hours a night. And it's not because he needed to wake up early and he's like, I have this really specific thing I got to wake up for. He's like, no. I need at least 9 hours of sleep if I'm going to be able to exert the amount of physical force I'm trying to in my life. Another thing Brian would do, he was the absolute worst person you could invite to help you move, which makes no sense at all because he's the strongest person you've ever met, okay? But if you're there and you're lifting a heavy edge of a couch and you're like, hey, could you grab this? Brian would never grab the other side. He'd be like, I'll take the lamp, you know? Like he was that guy who like just carried one thing at a time out to the truck. And the reason was because he didn't want to risk getting hurt, which I always felt as a small, skinny man, that is BS. You are literally the size of a horse. Help me carry this dang thing. Here's the thing though, right? Brian was devoted to something. he was devoted to it. It wasn't just something that had a corner of his life that he was like, I do this some days. He was like, no, my whole life is oriented around doing one thing. And because he was devoted, without steroids and with a very proper stance, not some TikTok sumo stance type garbage, he could deadlift 793 pounds. He can deadlift 800 pounds. And if you're not impressed by that, you don't know much about actual competition deadlifting. It's very impressive. What takes the place of the highest value in your life will act as a litmus test for what you will or will not let you take your time and attention. You see, the thing that has like the highest value for you, that should act as this litmus test for you, that like everything else in your life is filtered by. And for Brian, right, everything in his life was filtered by, is this going to help me lift 800 pounds or is it not? And if it is, I'll do it. If it's not, I'm probably not going to do it. And you can't deadlift 800 pounds unless you live differently than everyone else every single day of the week. It's not a decision you can just make in the moment. It's something that actually your whole life has to be shaped towards. So what are you devoted to? What's the thing in your life that the rest of your life sort of bends and shifts around? And listen, if you don't have something that's that strong of an anchor for you, then you will be rudderless. You will be this like visionless person that's just pushed around by anything that feels urgent or feels really comfortable to you. And this is the tension with that, because if that's who you are, and you need to be really honest that some of you in the room, that is your life. You don't have vision. You don't have like a rudder. You don't have a course you're on. You're just kind of pushed here and you're pushed there. And you wake up and you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you go to sleep and your life kind of feels aimless and directionless. And you just need to be honest about that. But if that's who you are or who we are, because if we're honest, a little bit of our lives is like this, it's a problem because Christians are not rudderless, visionless people. We're not people who are meant to be tossed to and fro by kind of the algorithms of this world, but we've actually been given a story that gives us an identity and also gives us a goal and an ambition for our lives. The question is just whether we're living it or not. And so here's what's true. Your life of devotion to Christ, right? This whole life discipleship, devotion of him, your life of devotion to Christ will either be the controlling vision of your life that squeezes out most other things from your life, or the world will fill your life with so many things that eventually it will squeeze out your vision of following Jesus. And my fear in a church like this is, even with a lot of people who moved here to be like on a church plant, is that your life is now so filled with things that the very reason you moved here in the first place is getting squeezed out from your life. And so what we need is we need devotion. And you will either be devoted to Christ at the exclusion of many other things, or you will be devoted to other things at the exclusion of Christ. There's no middle road. There's no middle road. And you see, we live a lot of our lives, and I think we're making a pretty serious mistake. Because what a lot of us are trying to do is we're trying to make space in our busy lives for Jesus. Does that feel like your story? You're like, my life's super busy, but I'm really trying to make time for Jesus, right? That feels like my life. Like, I'm a pastor, and I still feel like, if you'd ask me, like, what does your life feel like? It feels like I'm very busy, and I'm trying to make time for Jesus. Well, I think that's a problem, because the whole picture that Jesus gives us of following him is the kind of relationship that actually gives little space for the whole rest of life. And so we have this thing that happens, right? Where like we take our lives and we go, this is who we are. This is what I'm doing. And if it's possible, I want to try to include Jesus in that. And Jesus says, no, I want to become your life. I want you to become a disciple. I want this really simple vision to take over your entire life. And if you have time to do other things, you should also do those. It's such a different way of viewing the world, but to become a disciple of Jesus was a decision that excluded most of the other things the rest of the world did with their time. Like, I don't think you can become who you are if at the end of your life, 15 years of your life was just wasted on the same things the world wasted on. I don't know how we're going to become saints, to become these spiritually powerful people if we waste that much time. I don't know how it will happen. And so to become a follower of Jesus is actually, it involves excluding ourselves from some things that are not bad things. They're good things. They're just not the ultimate things we're made to do. And so if you want to be conformed to the image of Christ, if you want to live the life of a disciple, you just simply won't have that much room for other things. And it doesn't mean you can't have any hobbies. Like Jesus did some stuff, and you could do some stuff too. But honestly, if your goal in life is to be conformed to the image of Christ, if your goal in life is to actually become who you are, you're not going to have that much time left over for a bunch of other stuff. Andrew the other day asked me if I wanted to run a marathon. I said, probably not, but okay, we'll talk about it, And the thing we were laughing about is we're like, that's not even that ambitious of a thing. Like, a lot of people run marathons, but we were still like, man, you have all this training regimen you have to do. And it's like, if you want to decide, I want to do that, I want to become a marathon runner, you have to basically count the cost of that. And I think for a lot of us, we're in this place where we're like, I want to become like Jesus, but we haven't actually counted the cost. And it's one of the very first things Jesus does when he's calling people is he's like, hey, there's a cost to discipleship. It's going to cost you your boat. Can't stay in it anymore because I'm not sticking around here. I'm going to do stuff. It's going to cost you a lot of the things you just are kind of comfort mechanisms for you. You're like, I don't know, I'm tired, and I come home, and this is just what I do to unwind, and I do it for like an hour or two. This isn't bad. It's not like Jesus is like, stop doing that. That's bad. It's just Jesus is like, hey, I'm trying to call you to something that's higher than that. And if you give your life to that, it's actually who you're going to become. So who are you becoming? This is what John Comer says. It's really helpful. He says, the reason this is so important for us to ask this question is because what you give your attention to is the person you become. Put another way, the mind is the portal to the soul, and what you fill your mind with will shape the trajectory of your character. Listen to this. In the end, your life is no more than the sum of what you gave your attention to. So what are you giving your attention to, Christian? And what do you want to be giving your attention to? Because sometimes there's a huge difference between who we want. We want to be focusing on what we actually are. And so to become what we are, we need to focus our attention on Jesus. Let me talk about this. This is a picture of worship. You see, what we're talking about, we're not just talking about spending time, we're talking about cultivating this life where you're actually like leaving the normal patterns and rhythms of everyone else, and you're like in a posture of devotion, focusing on Jesus, right? And the thing we're talking about is worship. Listen to what James K. Smith says about worship. He says, instead of like the bottom-up emphasis on worship as our expression of devotion and praise, historic Christian worship is actually rooted in the conviction that God is the primary actor or agent in the worship encounter. Meaning, worship works from the top down, you might say. In worship, we don't just come to God and have like our devotion and give him our praise, but we're actually called to worship because it's in this encounter of devotion, giving our attention, right? Like our attention is like the one thing we have to give. And so at the center of worship is just attention on God. We're called to worship because it's in this encounter God remakes and molds us top down. He says worship is the arena in which God recalibrates our hearts, reforms our desires, and rehabituates our love. Worship isn't just something we do. It is where God does something to us. Worship is the heart of discipleship because it is the gymnasium in which God retrains our hearts. And so we're talking about devotion. And we're talking about we're people who are formed by devotion. Like the thing that you give your attention to and the thing you pursue wholeheartedly, that will be the thing that shapes who you are. And here's the tension with this, right? Because if you're a follower of Jesus, you know that actually your whole life over time is meant to become one where all the way from the top to the bottom, it is one of devotion to Christ. But the reality is we're not those people, right? We're people who are pretty distracted. And Jesus maybe has a little corner of our life, but he certainly doesn't have the whole thing. And there's the thing, I don't think Jesus is like that bummed out about that or that disappointed by that. I think what he's saying is he's like, oh, I totally get that. I totally understand. And what I've given to you to help form you into the person I want you to be is devotion. And he's saying, what I want you to do is I want you to actually come away with me into these spaces with me and to focus on me. And as you do that, I will actually begin to change your heart so that that moment of devotion that happens will actually begin to flow out into the rest of your life. And so here's, I think, what can be challenging, right? Because sometimes you hear something like this and you're like, man, my heart's all over the place. Like I'm way more concerned about my grades than I am Jesus. I'm way more concerned about what I'm going to do this afternoon than I am about becoming anything like the image of Christ. And I think that's just true. And so the question is how do we become these all-encompassing people who are totally devoted to Jesus? Well, I don't think the answer is just to take that huge, massive vision and to say, I'm going to become that person, right? I don't think you can do that. But I think what you can actually do is you can take your really, really busy life and you can start to look at something and you can say, I don't need that. It's not helped me become like Jesus. If anything, it's helped me become not like him. And you can actually just kind of carve out of your life a little tiny space. And it won't be everything about your life, but it'll be some part of your life. And this could be like in the morning, it could be in the afternoon, it could be in the evening. And what you do is you just say, this time, this space, I don't know how to be devoted to Jesus in my whole life, but I can actually learn how to be devoted to him here. And so maybe for you, it's 10 minutes. And that would be like a big step for you is I'm just gonna have 10 minutes where my whole existence, I'm gonna devote myself to God within this little space. And what will happen if you do that is even though that little space is a tiny part of your life, it will actually begin to retrain your heart so that actually as you leave that space, the retraining will go with you. And eventually that space will begin to grow. And eventually you'll become this person that's like, well, that's not enough to have it here. I need to have it later in my day. And you have another part of your day that's like, I'm going to come back to this place of devotion to Jesus. And eventually you're going to have another space. And eventually you become this person that over time, you're like, I'm actually really living this life of devotion, not just in that moment, but actually through most of my life. But it starts small. And a lot of us, we don't even have that small thing. And so I want to challenge us not just to rehearse our stories like we did last week, but I want to challenge you to find a way to carve out in your life an area of your life that you can say, I'm going to practice devotion here. So that hopefully that will begin to expand in every single other area of my life. One of the ways that we do that is by taking communion together. Communion, do you ever notice how weird it is? Communion is something that we do once a week or we do once every couple weeks. We don't do it every day, but it's meant to be this thing that's like this centering thing you come and you do that shapes you in this moment, where you in this moment, you are trying as much as you can to devote all of yourself to the man on the cross. You're living this life of total simplicity. You're forget everything else in my life. I'm going to just focus on the body and the blood of this man, Jesus Christ, who shed his blood for me. And in that moment of devotion, you see what Jesus is trying to do is he's actually trying to change your heart in that moment so that when you leave this place, you're leaving a tiny bit changed like him. And so I want to give us some time to do that. The band's going to come up and play. And I want to just give you some space. You might be somebody right now who the story we talked about at the beginning is your story. And you're like, yeah, I've never gotten out of the boat. Part of me loves Jesus, but I've never actually lived a true life of discipleship, and my whole life's always been oriented towards something else but Christ. If that's you, I just want to invite you to just tell Jesus that. Just tell him. Be honest about that. Meet Jesus at his cross, because he came for people exactly like you. And he wants to invite you into a deeper experience of rest than this world can give you. And if you're somebody that even maybe just no, I've gotten out of the boat, but man, I'm distracted. My life is filled with so many things right now. I want to just give you a moment to just take some of those things, just unload them at the feet of Jesus, and just once again come to a place of just devotion to him. Try to simplify your heart before him and say, Jesus, I want you and you alone. And would you just meet Jesus here in this place? And so the way we take communion is we actually get up out of our chairs and we come up and we grab the bread, which symbolizes the body of Jesus that was broken for us, and we dip it in the cup that represents the blood of Jesus that was spilled for us. And what we're doing in that moment is we're reminding ourselves who we are, our true story, but we're also reminding ourselves who we want to be. We want to become like this crucified Savior. And every single thing you need to become like Jesus is happening right there. Like it's already done, it's finished, right? This is what Jesus said on the cross. He's like, it is finished. And so today we have an opportunity to remember not just who we are, but who Jesus is making us to be. Let's take communion together.